Thank you, Owen, and thank you all for coming. What I want to try and do is to open up a question about the relationship between red and green politics by trying to address some of the things that I think haunt the possibility of strategic and tactical alliances. I have a written paper, and I'm going to mostly read and improvise a few remarks as I go along. When I first agreed to do this, I imagined a much smaller room of political activists, so I apologize if this isn't quite as entertaining for all of you as you might hope. We live in dark times, in a dark ecology. This year it became clear that Volkswagen had been engaged in systematic and global fraud to disguise the extent of emissions from its diesel cars and vans in defiance of attempts to regulate the car industry. Even the modest public health targets of environmental protection agencies were worth nothing as compared with a global car industry strategy based on lies about clean diesel. Enough, to my mind, to suggest that Volkswagen are guilty of corporate manslaughter. But you don't need to be a sophisticated critical theorist to understand the deception. ExxonMobil, it's been revealed in the last month, knew full well about the dangers of burning fossil fuels as early as the 1970s, when it would still be possible to have done something about the emerging crisis. But rather than act in the interests of humanity, Exxon organised corporate denials of the risks of global warming and, to make it worse, secretly engaged in calculations on access to oil fields that would be revealed and made accessible by the retreating ice caps under the climate change that they were themselves studying. Not only did they know about the problem of climate change, they were planning to capitalise on it by building oil that would make it worse. Bill McKibben, well known for his book The Death of Nature, comments, "This company had the singular capacity to change the course of world history for the better, and instead it changed the course for the infinitely worse. In its greed, Exxon helped more than any other institution to kill our planet." China, still nominally a communist society, appears set to build their first nuclear plant outside of China, in, of all places, Essex. Anyone who has looked at scientific predictions for the global ecology of water knows that situating a water-cooled nuclear power station on an estuary this close to London is sheer madness, as Fukushima has already demonstrated, especially when wind power has become the cheapest source of energy. And yet, once built, this nuclear power station and its effects will be almost impossible to unravel this side of doomsday. Note here that water is the unacknowledged oil of world ecology. Such dark times and such stark revelations might be imagined as preludes to revolutionary struggles, part of a wave of protest against the destruction of the planet at the hands of capital, and now, if it's not already too late. And yet, for all the local excitements of campaigns around Jeremy Corbyn or perhaps Bernie Sanders, there's a palpable gulf in the structure of feeling that might otherwise unite the anti-capitalist politics of ecological activists with the anti-capitalist labour movement politics of socialists and revolutionary Marxists. And it's that gulf in the structure of feeling that we need to address. We might take as symptomatic Howard Parsons' supposedly Marxist rebuke to ecological activists from 1977. I laughed out loud when I read this. He writes, "The ecological movement in capitalist countries, which is so frequently dominated by well-intentioned liberals who are not aware of the factor of class in society, must be informed with a class perspective and infused with class action." Slogans about creating jobs while protecting the environment point to the perceived conflict of interest among national electorates. So we have a series of crises of global ecology that go beyond national borders and beyond existing regulative frameworks, but somehow, rather than delineating the need for global agencies to wrest power away from capital, these crises become mired in various kinds of local skepticism about the agency of public opinion, about armchair activism, about scientific expertise, and a skepticism that runs deep about the success of any kind of state regulation. All of which points us away from sites of possible struggle into a generalised sense of impending disaster. Self-evidently necessary, the Red-Green alliance looks as fragile as the ecological case for fracking. Why? The ecology of critical theory, an allegory that becomes reality. In the late 1940s, Joseph Stalin promulgated what by 1952 became known as the Great Plan for the Transformation of Nature, an ambitious land, agricultural and water redirection project. The project was a response to the 1946 drought and subsequent 1947 famine, which led to the premature death of as many as 500,000 to 1 million people. Modelled on responses in the United States to drought in the Dust Bowl years of the 30s, the Soviet plan involved hydroengineering, strategic shelter belts, and a network of irrigation canals built into the steppe belts of the southern Soviet Union and into the deserts of Central Asia. After Stalin's death, the plan was stalled and then criticised, a culture of criticism that was made possible by the discrediting of the overseeing agronomist Trofim Lysenko. Having developed theories for increased crop yields and biogenetic mutual assistance, Lysenko was a key figure in Stalin's planned transformation of nature. In the years after the Stalinist terror, scientific dissent from Lysenko's theories of environmentally acquired hereditary material Sorry, I've misread this. In the immediate years of the Stalin terror, it was illegal in Russia to criticize Lysenko. But once Stalin was dead, it became possible gradually for criticism to begin, such that by 1964, Andrei Sakharov could speak out against Lysenko in the General Assembly of the Academy of Sciences, saying, "He is responsible for the shameful backwardness of Soviet biology and of genetics in particular, for the dissemination of pseudoscientific views, for adventurism, for the degradation of learning, and for the defamation, firing, arrest, even death of many genuine scientists." So, the principal scientist in charge of the Great Plan for the Transformation of Nature was involved in falsification practices and complicit with the premature death of scientists who otherwise disagreed with him. Despite some now discredited theories of biogenetics, the projects associated with this great plan were nevertheless based on relatively sound ecological principles that remain relevant, not least the understanding of agriculture holistically in relation to water resources and the need to reduce soil erosion in dry areas rather than simply redirecting water from water-rich areas into dry areas. Part of the success of the irrigation projects instigated by Stalin and overseen by Lysenko is that for more than a half a century, Uzbekistan has been one of the world's major producers of cotton. A number of us here today are probably wearing cotton from the ecologically disastrous forced labour fields of Uzbekistan set in train by Stalin. Aspects of Stalin's plan in this sense were successful. Unfortunately, cotton production demands large quantities of water. Diverted river and water sources have led to the drying up of the Aral Sea, once the fourth largest lake in the world. The shrinking of the Aral Sea deserves to be considered one of the planet's worst humanly made environmental disasters. The pursuit of cotton production and industrial agriculture has polluted and devastated both the air and water of Uzbekistan and the countries around the Aral Sea, but not just in Uzbekistan. Pesticides such as the DDT that were used to increase crop yields in the period of the Great Transformation of Nature have come to the surface as water levels have dropped, allowing toxic chemicals to become airborne, such that some scientists claim to have found traces of Soviet pesticides from Uzbekistan in the bloodstream of penguins in Antarctica. If this were not enough, the scale of the cotton industry in Uzbekistan involves an estimated 1 million people in the picking of cotton, involving systematic use of forced labour and forced child labour. Anti-slavery campaigns include the Cotton Campaign, whose website describes the organisation, the Cotton Campaign, as a global coalition of human rights, labour, investor and business organisations dedicated to eradicating child labour and forced labour in cotton production. I'm suspicious of business organisations dedicated to eradicating forced labour, but nevertheless, that's the alliance. On their website, they declare, "Our goals are to end the state systems of forced labour in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan's cotton sectors." So, from Stalin's plan to transform nature, there was indeed a transformation of nature, which involved the destruction and structural contamination of the Central Asian water supply. and in ways that have led to a state-run economics of forced labour. At the end of this sorry story, it might be worth remembering that Stalin's Great Plan was a response to the droughts of 46 and the subsequent famine that may have killed as many as 1 million people. Would it have been better to have understood famine as a natural disaster and not made the plan? How far is Marxism, and indeed Karl Marx, responsible for this sorry state? It's perhaps unsurprising that ecological activists view communist capitalism as no better than capitalist capitalism. Western labour movements have often aspired to unfettered productivity rather than ecological sustainability, and there's a clear tension between political models of activism that emphasise global ecology, some kind of solidarity with nature, as opposed to models grounded in the relations of production and productivity, often with a deeply irrational commitment to economic growth for growth's sake, but with an emphasis on the eradication of poverty and unnecessary human suffering, such as famine, over the preservation of nature as such. The state capitalist economics of Soviet communism and post-USSR countries have been environmentally and ecologically difficult, if not disastrous, too wedded to a model of productivity that has not worked. But how far does this reflect a failure of Marxist critical theory? The ecology of water in relation to agriculture is evidently critical for the future of Uzbekistan and the whole region. Indeed, a number of recent counts have drawn attention to the critical role of water supplies in Syria. The succession of droughts from 2006 to 2011 in Syria, almost certainly exacerbated by climate change, led to extensive migrations that became part of the ongoing civil war that has displaced millions of people and destabilised the already dubious refugee politics of the European Union. Climate change is beginning to destroy not just the environment, but the political institutions of European capital. Water, then, is critical. But does critical theory have much to say on the matter? Note, too, that the question of Stalinist ecology points to the critical problem of understanding the relation between what is perceived as a politically urgent priority, the hubris of any human plan, along with attendant models of production and science in the making of world ecology. Anthropocene Marxism, the return of holistic social science. In 2014, Mackenzie Wark published a manifesto entitled Critical Theory After the Anthropocene, which goes in conjunction with this book from Verso, offering some brief arguments around the Anthropocene to indicate the necessity of new arguments in critical theory, abandoning the privilege in sociological and cultural theory afforded to ideological superstructures. His manifesto, I think, is worth quoting at some length in this context. Amid some striking and provocative propositions, he writes, critical theory need not submit itself to scientific knowledge, but it needs to accept its existence and the validity of its methods. One has to know when one's tactics, even if correct in themselves, put you on the wrong side of history. Means for enduring the Anthropocene are not going to be exclusively cultural or political, let alone theological. They will also have to be scientific and technical. A united front of many kinds of knowledge and labour is absolutely necessary. To imagine that the political or revolution or communism will now work the miracles they so failed to work in the last 2 centuries is a charming habit of thought, but not a useful one. In the domain of praxis, everything is yet to be invented. And so it is not enough just to critique the Anthropocene with the tired old theory toolbox handed down now for more than 1 generation through the graduate schools. The Anthropocene is a standing rebuke to the exhaustion of those hallowed texts. Let's have done with answering all contingencies with the old quotations from Freud and Heidegger, Lukács and Benjamin, Althusser and Foucault. It is time for critical theory to acknowledge its conservative habits and to break with them. Among the shifts in emphasis that Wark goes on to suggest is a new focus on the complexity of aggregating praxis across scientific and technical arguments that critical theory has traditionally viewed with suspicion. The Lysenko case suggests that the significance of the agency of scientists has often been underplayed in traditional Marxist conceptions of the proletariat as the preeminent agent of social change. critical theory by implication needs to get its hands dirty, to work out what's going on in the agency of science. And that's partly why I think it's significant that you don't need a highly sophisticated critical theory to understand that Volkswagen were engaged in mass deception of the world in relation to emissions. But you might need a sophisticated critical theory to work out what they were thinking when they did that, because it seems, frankly, unthinkable. So, it would appear that critical theory has been quicker to declare principled resistance to the technocratic military-industrial complex, etc., rather than engaging in the mediation of political agency involved in technocratic regulation and planning. You can imagine, I think, this is powerfully the case with kind of humanist critical theorists who scarcely get their hands dirty with the awkward problems of regulation and administrative bureaucracy associated with what it means to take control of capital at the local level. The human need for radical planning and regulation at a global level cuts across the agency of workers in specific sectors of production, notably in the generation of energy from fossil fuels and nuclear power, but also in the distribution of water and in the global economies of food and clothing. One of the questions being asked by security analysts is what on earth the government thinks they're doing, allowing the Chinese Red Army industrial espionage units access to the nuclear industry at the centre of Britain. It's quite clear that there's an ongoing kind of process of cyber hacking in relation to how you gather knowledge from Western capitalist interests, and how that might go to the centre of government in relation to the nuclear industry would seem to be quite a sensitive issue. What is the Tory party doing, thinking that it would be a good idea to invite the Chinese right into the middle of that? Well, we should understand that historically this is not an unusual phenomenon. You may not be familiar with this, but the British Navy didn't think it was worth telling the British government that they'd installed a nuclear reactor in the centre of London. So through most of the second half of the 20th century, there was a nice little nuclear reactor working at Greenwich. The Navy thought it was important to have one, without them even telling the government. So clearly, there are bits of the British state that think that they can control the secrecy in this construction of nuclear problems in a way that would mean that they're not interested in talking to their democratic or political leaders. So we have the beginnings of an instance of a complicated set of kind of interactions around how we might regulate nuclear power, where it looks like all kinds of structures of agency and mediation are being allowed to kind of drift through without proper critical interrogation, and that somehow that's too low for critical theory in the high tradition to tackle. So, if the ecology of global capital puts the sustainability of human production in question, this in turn means that the agency of scientists and workers in their place of work comes under scrutiny. But perhaps with a sense that there's something more interesting about the pathos of the worker than the pathos of the regulative technocrat. We lack a heroic story about the regulative technocrat. You can see just saying it sounds ridiculous. One key instance of this in British class relations is the pathos and nostalgia associated with the decline and privatisation of the mining and coal industry, along with the steel, shipbuilding and car industries, red car, if you like. Protecting the jobs and lives of workers, industrial workers, comes into conflict with protecting the environment. How are the necessary decisions and judgments about priorities, plans and regulative frameworks to be developed without scientists, technocrats, and, to use the old glorious Soviet word, agronomists? Such modes of practice are critical for understanding how the forces in relation to production might be redirected and socialised effectively, all of which implies the need for critical theory to rethink the status of its own ecology, not least within the ecology of the university. Mackenzie, hence his, in that quotation I had, hence his notion that the graduate schools have been mediating this tradition of high theory that's been completely at odds with the ongoing reality. Mackenzie Walk, in his book Molecular Red Theory for the Anthropocene, suggests a turn to what he calls low theory, a strategic and tactical alliance capable of taking on what he calls the carbon liberation front, through a turn away from the philosophical and cultural emphases associated with critical theory. What are the implications of what he's suggesting? One of the kind of strategic arguments that Walk makes is to suggest the need to reinvent critical theory, turning away from the cultural focus on ideological superstructures towards what might be understood as the traditional dynamics of the base superstructure metaphor in Marxist critical theory. The Anthropocene calls us to think the holistic base rather than focusing on the symptoms and ideological crevices and niches of the ideological superstructure. How then can we begin a sense of the different ecological thinking necessary to make up some understanding of this base superstructure metaphor? And this is where I finally get to Marx. Rather than being a metaphor of a fixed building with a foundational base on top of which a superstructure is built, Marx's metaphor owes rather a lot to the metaphoricity of the railways, newly emergent in the mid-19th century. Understood as a railway metaphor, the base is the railway track, and the superstructure is the train, or rolling stock, all of which implies a rather different dynamic of symbiosis from the familiar models of determinism. And I think this was a deliberate rhetorical kind of touch by Marx to suggest something distinctively modern about the nature of the relation of capital. He didn't want to ground the nature of capital in some natural metaphor of base and superstructure, but precisely some contemporary historical nature, like the railway, as a way of understanding what was novel about this new set of social relations that were operating under the base and superstructure model of capital. And yet, even allowing for metaphor as a question of rhetorical emphasis rather than substantive argument, how far is the railroad really a historical model for understanding the nature of capitalism? What if the metaphors of historical determination cannot be grounded in this kind of metaphor, natural or otherwise, hence the necessity of invoking the historical originality of the railroad? In his articles on India, Marx himself saw the significance of the introduction of the railroad to India as a significant historical intervention pursued in the interest of capital, but nevertheless with an array of historical consequences. He writes, this is around about 1853, "I know that the English millocracy intend to endow India with railways with the exclusive view of extracting at diminished expenses the cotton again, and other raw materials for their manufactures. But when you have once introduced machinery into the locomotion of a country which possesses iron and coals, you are unable to withhold it from its fabrication. You cannot maintain a net of railways over an immense country without introducing all those industrial processes necessary to meet the immediate and current wants of railway locomotion, and out of which there must grow the application of machinery to those branches of industry not immediately connected with railways." So, for Marx, there is a capitalist intervention in the ecology of India, all about the extraction of raw materials and what we might think of as nature, so that the appropriation of nature for capital is kind of clearly a violent and dangerous process. But Marx also imagines how the railway system will drive new industrial productions and relations through the ecology of Indian villages. Thereby, he imagines, creating the possibility for new social relations. Marx writes, "The devastating effects of English industry, when contemplated with regard to India, are palpable and confounding. But we must not forget that they are only the organic results of the whole system of production as it is now constituted. That production rests on the supreme rule of capital. The centralization of capital is essential to the existence of capital as an independent power. The destructive influence of that centralization upon the markets of the world does but reveal, in the most gigantic dimensions, the inherent organic laws of political economy now at work in every civilized town. The bourgeois period of history has to create the material basis of the new world. On the one hand, universal intercourse founded upon the mutual dependency of mankind and the means of that intercourse. On the other hand, the development of the productive powers of man and the transformation of material production into a scientific domination of natural agencies. Bourgeois industry and commerce create these material conditions of a new world in the same way as geological revolutions have created the surface of the earth." So, on the one hand, Marx could be read as defending a dialectical conspectus of the industrial ecology of the railway system. On the one hand, a capitalist exploitation of natural raw materials and human labour, and yet on the other hand, some bizarre, unintentional instrument of progress. What has been more evident to ecological critics of Marx and of Marxism, however, is the sense that Marx welcomes the violence of this new industrial ecology as a potentially progressive force in which the productive powers of man transform material production into a scientific domination of nature. Is this not cognate with Stalin's great plan? The domination of nature emerges as a major critical motif in the attenuated Marxism of critical theory in Marcuse, Max Horkheimer, and Adorno, not least as the dialectic of enlightenment, but without quite being able to identify or suggest new agencies capable of resisting the logic of the domination of nature unleashed by capital. In the light of his later studies, Marx might have wished to nuance the claims implicit in what I've just read about the organic laws of political economy now at work in every civilized town. Why civilized town? Why organic laws? I think he's trying to avoid saying natural laws, but organic laws sounds rather similar. Along with the productivist tendency, Marx often flirts with the rhetoric of a scientific description of political economy that would discern its laws as if thereby analysing the nature of capital. There's a model of natural history and laws that runs through what it would mean to provide a science of political economy. So his discussion of the way the railroad will inevitably transform the grip of village society in India also sheds some light on the famous phrase, the idiocy of rural life, as it appears in the English translations of the Communist Manifesto. Preference for the town over agrarian life, albeit while arguing for the gradual dissolution of the differences between town and country, appears to be an almost self-evident Marxist maxim. Indeed, many a Marxist urbanist has taken comfort for having an ally in Marx against the nature-loving romantic socialists who would rather sweep away industrialized modernity than push on into the revolutionary future. And I've been guilty of a bit of that myself. However, this phrase, the idiocy of rural life, can hardly endear Marx to ecological activists already nervous about Marx's complicity with the industrial capitalism he sought to criticize, complicity indeed with the domination of nature. Perhaps because of this, the political tensions embodied in this phrase, the translation has been queried, notably by Hal Draper. He writes, idiocy of rural life. This oft-quoted authorized English translation expression is a mistranslation. The German word idiotismus did not and does not mean idiocy, idiotie. It usually means idiom, like its French cognate idiotisme. But here, in paragraph 28 of the Communist Manifesto, it means neither. In the 19th century, German still retained the original Greek meaning of forms based on the word idiotes, a private person withdrawn from the public communal concerns, apolitical in the original sense of isolation from the larger community. In the manifesto, it was being used by a scholar who had recently written his doctoral dissertation on Greek philosophy and liked to read Aeschylus in the original. What the rural population had to be saved from then was the privatized apartness of a lifestyle isolated from the larger society, the classic stasis of peasant life. To inject the English idiocy into this thought is to muddle everything. The original Greek meaning, which in the 19th century was still alive in German alongside the idiom meaning, had been lost in English centuries ago. Moore, the translator of the authorized English translation, was probably not aware of this problem. Engels had probably known it 40 years before. He was certainly familiar with the thought behind it. In his Condition of the Working Class in England, he had written about the rural weavers as a class which had remained sunk in apathetic indifference to the universal interests of mankind, and so it goes on. In 1873, Engels made exactly the manifesto's point without using the word idiocy. The abolition of the town-country antithesis will be able to deliver the rural population from the isolation and stupor in which it has vegetated almost unchanged for thousands of years. So, the isolation of rural life, not the idiocy. In this sense, Marx's criticism of the isolation of rural life had to do with the antithesis of town and country under capitalism, as expressed throughout Marx's work. And yet, even if this correction is accurate, it seems to me the damage has been done. And the perception of Marx and Marxism siding with the industrial proletariat over peasants and rural life rests on more than a mere phrase. Isolated life doesn't suggest that you have much sympathy with what's going on in rural life. Well, revisionist attempts to rethink and translate the implicit ecological politics of Marx have been gaining strength over the last 2 decades or so. One of the most important books, I think, is Paul Burkett's Marx and Nature from 1999, which has recently been published 2014. And what Burkett outlines and effectively dispenses with, I think, are 3 common criticisms of Marx. Namely, 1, that Marx fell prey to a productivist or Prometheus vision under which capitalist development of the productive forces allows human production to completely overcome natural constraints. in which communism is projected as extending and rationalizing capitalism drive toward complete human domination over nature, and in which both capitalism and communism demonstrate an inevitable antagonism between humanity and nature. All wrong, according to Burkett, and I think he shows why that would be fair to Marx, suggests that this isn't what Marx thought. He also shows how Marx's analysis of capital does not exclude or downgrade the contribution of nature to production, and that this also applies to Marx's labour theory of value. Moreover, he suggests that Marx's critique of the contradiction of capitals does not have nothing to do with nature or the natural conditions of production. As Burkett shows in some textual detail, there's plenty of evidence that Marx didn't think many of the things people accuse him of in regard to nature. Enough, indeed, to support the view that Marx's conception of communism is consistent with what Burkett calls ecologically sound human production. As with the idiocy of rural life, however, and the persistent instrumentalism of the base superstructure metaphor, we might be struck by the ecology of misreading being driven by more powerful types of agency than mere rhetoric. It will take more than careful readings of Marx to dispel the myths of Promethean Marxism. We might need to imagine what would be involved in retracing some process that would restore the Aral Sea, that would begin to think what it would mean to pull back on certain aspects of the Stalinist transformation of nature, and that would involve more than reading to convince people that Marxism wasn't as people have feared it is. Nevertheless, there are some quite simple rebukes to misconceptions of Marx provided by Marx, and the question as to why people ignored them becomes politically significant. For example, in the critique of the Gotha programme, faced with the claim that labour is the source of wealth and all culture, and since useful labour is possible only in society and through society, the proceeds of labour belong undiminished with equal right to all members of society, Marx writes, and the important bit is labour is the source of wealth and all culture, he writes, labour is not the source of all wealth. Nature is just as much the source of use values, and it is surely as such that material wealth consists, as labour, which itself is only the manifestation of a force of nature, human labour power. What then of this as yet unreconciled struggle between nature and human nature? If you hear the force of that, nature is just as much the source of use values as labour, which is itself only the manifestation of a force of nature, human labour power. In his recent book, Capitalism in the Web of Life, Ecology and the Accumulation of Capital, which has been out for about a month, Jason Moore suggests that the problem in such analyses of Marx and nature, indeed the very focus on some split between nature and human nature, constitutes a kind of Cartesian dualism that is in the way of our understanding of the politics of what's going on. He argues that the conceptual duality of society versus nature is part of the problem, politically and intellectually. The binary nature versus society, he writes, is directly implicated in the colossal violence, inequality, and oppression of the modern world, and that the view of nature as external is a fundamental condition of capital accumulation. Put differently, he writes, one substance, humanity, does not co-produce historical change with another substance called nature. Rather, the species specificity of humans is already co-produced within the web of life. I'm not quite sure I've got to grips with why he talks about the web of life. There's something rather odd about that phrase, and I haven't quite got to grips with what I think is going on in it. Nevertheless, what I think is clear is that he's attempting to restate the outlines of Marxist thinking through a conception of world ecology, arguing that the problem is the concept of nature in general, along with conceptions of the environment as an object, something external, rather than something produced by what he calls humanity-in-nature, not nature as it is produced. So what he's interested in is the co-production of nature as a form of humanity, humanity as a form of nature, and how that creates a series of environments that require a different kind of analysis in relation to, for example, food, than of the kinds we're familiar with. Where does all of this leave eco-Marxism? I'm nearly finished. There is an evident gulf between the history of critical theory and recent arguments in ecology, Marxism, and anti-capitalist activism. Without sustained accounts of what might be involved in meaningful structures of ecological planning and regulation, the spectre of the Stalinist plan to transform nature will continue to haunt the prospects for socialism or indeed communism. Without sustained alliances built across the ecology of intellectuals in the intersections between science, social science, and critical theory, the spectre of the Lysenko case will continue to haunt the prospects for a socialized science capable of tackling climate change and human poverty as mutually implicated but historically given legacies of the logic of capital. So what do I offer then as some kind of resulting conclusion? It seems pretty clear to me that we haven't begun to read the ecology of capital in Marx, and that there's a kind of close reading that needs to be done, and I'm attempting to do bits of it here and there, but it's hard work. And it's hard work partly because of the enormous work that Marx himself put into trying to understand that. So that you continue to discover that one little phrase or one little thing you thought was a kind of isolated, odd bit of Marx turns out to have rather deep structures. To give you one example, there's been quite a sustained attempt to suggest that some of Marx's interests in the early biology of the biosphere constitute a whole new notion of the metabolic rift in relation to the ontology of the natural and the human, out of which we might develop a politics of the biosphere that would have given us a completely different kind of capital and would have saved us a lot of trouble over the last 100 years if we'd got on with it rather than not reading Marx. And you read that and you think, okay, so I've got to do quite a lot of work to understand the politics, and then you decide actually that this is a kind of complicated ecological shift of argument that's taken you away from Marx. And that's exactly the kind of argument that Jason was saying, no, come back to Marx. There's a more central set of arguments about capital that you're missing if you go down that route. So the close reading of Marx is never easy. And it takes you into constructions of the problems of cotton or the problems of the railways in ways that are time-consuming. Nevertheless, it's work that needs to be done. And unless it's done, we won't bridge some of the gaps between the notion of Marx as some kind of communist doctrine and Marx as a lively critical theorist who was interested in what I think Mackenzie Walk means by low theory, tactical interventions, in particular local arguments, and attempt to build a larger theoretical kind of program around that. So there's a kind of practical task in the reading of Marx, which I think is self-evidently necessarily going to take place across the humanities and the social sciences, and might actually take us into the sciences in a way that will be really quite new for critical theory in relation to its textual and literary bias. The second implication of this, I think, is to think again about the ecology of the university. How is it that we got to the situation in which reading Marx could be so badly done, so awkwardly differentiated, such that we're still wandering around with great big fat dogmas of Marx that don't bear much relation to anything that Marx wrote? Well, the history of the communist movement might be held responsible, but the Western academy has not been acute in thinking through these texts, and the question has to be why? There's been a persistent interest in Marxist literary theory in literary departments, but not much evidence of anyone reading Marx terribly carefully. Why? Well, I think there has to be some accounting of the ecology of interests in the construction of the university around the sciences, social sciences, humanities, such that it's unlikely that an eager humanities kind of scholar is going to be engaging in the kind of project that emerges from what I'm suggesting. It's just too hard to imagine how you could do it. There's a version of this that I like where a colleague from Corpus Christi who recently died, Oliver Rackham, who's a man much interested in trees, explained that you could not do a PhD on trees because trees take longer than 3 years to grow, and you couldn't watch one and study it because it just wasn't possible. Something like trying to get to grips with the legacy of Marx is like that. It's almost impossible to pick off quickly. So that makes it look like there's an ecology of speed, accumulation of capital and interest in the ecology of the graduate student, of the research world. That, to my mind, points to the need for collaborative criticism. And that, too, is something that the humanities, perhaps less so in the social science, have found difficult. The idea of having to work with people rather than work as some creative lone genius strikes people to the marrow. And I myself used to think like this. You think, goodness me, a collective process of critical writing, that's doomed. So my question, in a way, is in order to overcome some of the problems of resourcing to mount the critiques necessary, we might need low theoretical collaboration across the disciplines in a way that would constitute a different kind of alliance. The fact that even that is so difficult to imagine makes it possible, I think, to understand why it's difficult to understand how socialism and green politics are ever going to get it together. Because at the local level of the university, we've scarcely managed it as an intellectual project. So you could argue that until it happens socially, it can't happen theoretically, but I'm very suspicious of that. So then you begin to kind of point this question beyond the ecology of academic discussion and debate and research into what's going on in the university itself. Everywhere you look in Cambridge, there are questions of how nature is being kind of shifted and structured according to the ecology of the university. The town is a massive building site. In whose interest, in whose name? If you ask the question of who owned what persistently, you would discover an emerging shift in the ownership of Cambridge, which is deeply related to various ecological interests associated with the biochemical industry, the drugs companies, the kind of cluster of companies around Addenbrooke's, a whole series of kind of interests that filter across different parts, Rolls-Royce, all the spin-off companies, Silicon Glen, all that kind of sort of stuff that's going on in Cambridge. Very little of it generates activism of a kind of politically direct kind, even around kind of struggles like keep our NHS public in Addenbrooke's. It's difficult to see how all the scientificity of the medical experiment that is going on in the research around Addenbrooke's could come together in a political activism with the people who work there and the people who kind of are in there for reasons that are not to do with work, like being ill. So the alliances necessary to build a kind of politics of health in relation to Addenbrooke's look extremely tricky. But they're there, we are living in them. You could apply this also to the Volkswagen issue. There's a whole economy of dangerous nitro oxide, I forget the technical term for it, the stuff that comes out of the back of diesel engines that's bad for you, is probably killing people in Cambridge as we walk around in it. It's certainly very dangerous for small children in buggies who are wandering around at the exact height that the fuel comes out. So if you have a small child, as I do, you have stared at the stuff coming out the back of diesel engines and thought, my God, that's going straight in the brain and lungs of my child. Can we not do something about it? Hence my fury, I think, that they could have pretended to have done something about it, but have been lying so systematically. Well, what's the nature of the response? I think the extent to which people as activists feel somewhat powerless in the face of what you would do about the Volkswagen scandal points to something about how, well, we're not powerless. We could kind of do all kinds of things, but is it really the case that we want to boycott Volkswagen or put up a picket outside the Volkswagen garages or somehow kind of stick cotton wool up the back of any Volkswagen diesel? It's not clear that the people who bought the diesels were the people who were exactly, but they were agents. It's not clear how you get to the agency of that without entering some deeply awkward set of arguments about who regulates, how do things get regulated, what are people's investment in the car industry, why do we need cars? And that points to part of the idiocy of Cambridge life, which is the whole structure of its environment of housing and the extent to which there are little satellite towns being built around it in which people will commute from places like Camborne into Cambridge rather than building out on the brownfields around Cambridge, which have to be protected because they're somehow part of our natural environment, despite the fact that this will involve bussing in large numbers of people who can't afford to live in Cambridge. We live in a very, very peculiar environment, and somehow we can't quite address it as political activists or as critical theorists. And there I'll stop.